This is the Lethal Gaming Gear X Pulsar Hyperion, a rather unexpected collaborative release from two of the biggest names in the peripheral space. Now, both Lethal Gaming Gear and Pulsar make a wide variety of mouse pads, both sporting a catalog that covers essentially every performance profile one could need from a mousepad. Because of this, while the Hyperion does perform differently enough to prevent it from feeling like a clone of one of Lethal Gaming Gear or Pulsar's existing pads, the pad does share many traits with both brands' existing pad lineups, specifically with the Lethal Gaming Gear Saturn series. But despite the similarities, the Hyperion is a very solidly performing pad, one that I actually really enjoyed testing. But sadly the pad isn't perfect, and it does have some issues you should keep in mind if you're considering picking up the pad. But we're going to talk all about the pros and the cons of the Hyperion and much more in today's episode of the mel0n Review. But before we get into it, I want to say a big thank you to Lethal Gaming Gear, who was kind enough to send over the Hyperion for review. As always, this video will be fully subtitled and time-stamped, so if you're looking for a particular topic, be sure to check the chapters down below. And if you enjoy the review and want to see more reviews like this, be sure to leave a like on the video and get subscribed. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. In terms of testing parameters, I used the Hyperion for approximately 3 weeks, daily driving the pad for both work and gaming. For skates, I tested every skate type in my collection as usual, but settled on using the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Air Donuts and the Unusual Way Sports Silver Fox skate dots for the majority of my testing, and for scents I played on my usual centimeter per 360 of 40 cm. Alright, let's talk in-game performance next. As I mentioned earlier, the Hyperion shares many similarities with Pulsar and Lethal Gaming Gear's other pads, but specifically the Saturn series from Lethal Gaming Gear in this case. This is actually hinted at in the pad's naming, as Hyperion is the name of one of Saturn's moons. Now, according to Lethal Gaming Gear, the Hyperion is designed to be a middle ground between the Venus and, unsurprisingly, the Saturn series. I'm not sure where it sits in terms of Pulsar's pads, as I haven't used their recent releases, but I assume the Hyperion feels like a middle ground between some of Pulsar pads as well. But despite the Hyperion's similarity to the Saturn and Venus series pads, it performs very differently. The closest analog I can really give is that the Hyperion feels like a much faster, lower friction Saturn Pro Firm, or a more controlled version of a Venus Pro Extra Soft. As such, the Hyperion feels very well rounded and universal in terms of its performance, making it ideal for not only static and flicking aiming, but also tracking and dynamic aiming. As such, the Hyperion is usable for not only static and flicking aiming games like Valorant or Counter-Strike 2, it's also perfect for more dynamic tracking games like Overwatch 2, Splitgate, and Marvel Rivals. Over my testing, as expected given its unique nature, the Hyperion performed exceptionally well in every game or aim type I threw at it, but I found it specifically good for more static focused aiming in games that are very movement focused, like Splitgate, Overwatch 2, and Quake. But unfortunately, this pad does have two flaws. One thing I don't really like about the pad is that its axes aren't balanced, as the pad is very X-axis optimized, and as I alluded to earlier, the pad's unique surfacing, which I'll talk more about in depth in a few minutes, is very susceptible to fur and debris. But aside from these issues, the Hyperion really did impress me over my testing, and this pad is a fantastic addition to both Lethal Gaming Gear and Pulsar's lineups. Just like Lethal Gaming Gear's Pro versions of their pads such as the Saturn Pro, the Hyperion is available in 3 levels of softness, 3 sizes, and 2 colorways. In terms of sizing, there is an extra large, which is 490 by 420 millimeters, an extra large square, which is 500 by 500 millimeters, and an XXL size, which is 1000 by 500 millimeters. All sizes are available in either extra soft, soft, or firm bases. The extra soft and soft base versions will be 4 millimeters thick, while the firm base version will be slightly thinner, coming in at around 3 millimeters thick. All versions, regardless of size or firmness, are available in a standard black color, the same as the black version of Lethal Gaming Gear's other pads, or in the new Midnight Slate colorway, which is a matte blue coloring new to both Lethal Gaming Gear and Pulsar's pad lineups. Now, on launch, only the soft and extra soft base versions of the Hyperion will be available. The firm base version will be releasing with the Hyperion's second batch, but currently there is no ETA on when that version will be launching. But if you're interested in getting the firm base version, keep an eye on Pulsar and Lethal Gaming Gear's social medias for updates on when the firm base version will be released. Now, for today, we're going to be talking about the extra large size, which is the 490 by 420 by 4 millimeters size, with the soft base in the black colorway. Now, in terms of unboxing, the Hyperion comes flat packed in a cardboard box. The packaging style is a top load style, the same as we saw for the Razer Strider. Now, taking the pad out of the packaging is relatively easy, but due to its design, repackaging the pad is very difficult, just as it was with the Razer Strider's packaging. I'm quite surprised that Lethal Gaming Gear and Pulsar didn't use the more standard envelope packaging style we've seen used for most, if not all, pads on the market, as that style of packaging still allows the pad to be flat packed, but since this packaging style opens from the back, not the top, it's much easier to repackage the pad for storage or transport as opposed to the current Hyperion's packaging. Now, I want to quickly clarify, the top loader style packaging is only going to be used for the extra large and extra large square versions of the Hyperion. The XXL version will be using the rolled packaging design similar to the packaging style we saw used for the Lethal Gaming Gear Neptune. Now, since the top loader style packaging makes it very difficult to repackage the Hyperion, Lethal Gaming Gear does say you can temporarily loosely roll the pad for transport, but if it's rolled for too long or too tightly, you can damage the pad. So while you technically can roll the pad for transport, again temporarily, you're better off cutting the sides of the pad's packaging open so you can open and close it like a book. That way you can repackage and transport the Hyperion without rolling it and potentially damaging it. Now, aside from the unique packaging choice here for the Hyperion, I also want to note that just like the Lethal Gaming Gear Saturn and their other pads, out of the box the Hyperion will likely have a strong chemical or plastic smell to it. This comes from the base and the dye used to color the surface. As such, I'd recommend airing out the pad for a few hours before you use it in order to dissipate as much of the smell as possible. It will naturally dissipate over time, but it can be a little overwhelming out of the box, so be sure to air it out for a few hours before you use the pad. Next up, let's talk about build quality and QC. As we've seen with all of Lethal Gaming Gear and Pulsar's pads, the Hyperion is, unsurprisingly, pretty much flawless. The pad's unique surface stitching is perfectly implemented with no uneven areas or dead zones. The base is also very well implemented. It is using Lethal Gaming Gear's new base type, which you'll be seeing on many of their upcoming pads. And the pad's edge stitching is also well implemented. There is one frayed stitch on the pad's left side where the edge stitching does terminate, but this isn't anything that's going to affect the pad's performance or durability. I should also note that my pad is technically speaking a pre-production unit, hence why the edge stitching is likely frayed, and I'd be very surprised if we saw any frayed stitching on the final release of versions, as those versions will likely have edge stitching to the same quality as the ones we see on their current pads. Alright, let's talk about the most interesting part of the Hyperion next, its surfacing. The pad surfacing is incredibly unique, arguably the most unique surfacing I've ever seen on a pad to date. To the hand, the surface feels similar to the Saturn's, but with slightly more textural feedback. Under the microscope, you can see that the pad surface stitching is this multi-layered wide circular knit weaving, which is made out of polyester, the same surface material as the Saturn Pro surfacing. The only remote comparisons I can make to the Hyperion surface stitching is that it reminds me of a hybridization between the ESB Tiger Tando SR and the Fnatic 2 Max's surfacing, as the surface weaving is similar-ish to the Tando SR, but the threading is thinner and the stitching is much wider and less tightly knit, and the multi-layered nature of the surfacing is very similar to the layered surfacing we saw in the Fnatic 2, just a little more denser knit here on the Hyperion. But again, these comparisons are very loose, and no other pad I've personally tested has a surfacing anywhere close to what we see here on the Hyperion. Now, taking a closer look again at the Hyperion's surface, you can see that the surface layer weaving runs bi-directionally along the pad's x-axis, not on the y-axis like the Saturn surfacing did, and that the layers underneath the surface layer run along the pad's other axes. This means that movements along the pad's x-axis will be the lowest friction or the fastest, and movements on the y-axis will be slightly higher friction or the slowest, as you're moving against the linearity of the surface weaving. Now, on the soft base version of the Hyperion, the difference between the x and y axis isn't particularly noticeable as the difference is very slight, but keep in mind I was mainly using dots and donut skates over my testing. When I used larger, more controlled full-size skates, the difference in the pad's x and y axis frictions was much more noticeable. On the extra soft base version of the Hyperion, I assume the differing axis frictions will be more pronounced, and on the firm base versions, the difference will likely be less noticeable, even less than it is here on the soft base version, but your experience will definitely vary from mine depending on the skate type you use and their material type and their shaping. Now, in terms of the Hyperion friction profiles, unlike the Saturn Pro, which this pad is loosely based on, which had lower initial and braking frictions with a higher degree of dynamic friction, the Hyperion's frictions are much more balanced, having slightly less less initial and breaking friction than the Saturn Pro Firm did, while also having slightly less dynamic friction. The dynamic friction here on the Hyperion feels equal to the pad's initial and breaking frictions, which makes the pad feel very well balanced in terms of its overall friction coefficients, making it perform, like I mentioned earlier, a faster Saturn Pro Firm, but with balanced friction coefficients. This is what gives the Hyperion its well-rounded in-game performance as usable for all aim and game types, and as such, I'd best classify the soft base Hyperion as a balance pad, as it's faster than the Saturn Pro Firm, but more controlled than a Venus Pro Extra Soft. On the other base versions of the Hyperion, the Extra Soft base and Firm base versions will likely still be categorized in the balanced performance category, but the Firm base version will be slightly faster than the soft base version, and the Extra Soft version will be slightly more controlled, but all versions will still be faster than the Saturn Pro lineup, but more controlled than the Venus Pro lineup, just to differing degrees depending on what base type you choose. Now, since I have the soft base version of the Hyperion, I want to quickly talk about the degree of softness and range of control variability next. Compared to the Saturn Pro Firm, the Hyperion's degree of softness is much higher, but it's still not as soft as a more traditional control pad is, for example like the softness you'd find on the Infinity Mice Shogun. So on the soft base version of the Hyperion, there is a usable degree of softness, albeit smaller than you traditionally find, but a usable range nonetheless. This means that you can press your mouse into the pad to increase the pad's friction coefficients, making it more controlled, but the degree as to how much control you'll gain will vary depending on your grip style, hand weight, and what skate size, material, and shape you use. Now, on the other versions of the Hyperion, the firm base variant, just like the Saturn Pro Firm, won't have any usable degree of control variability, and on the extra soft base variant, there'll be a much larger degree of softness, more akin to the softness you find on other control pads like the Shogun I mentioned earlier. I also wanted to mention that the rebound speed of the base will change depending on what base variant of the Hyperion you get. The firm base will be the fastest, the extra soft base will be the slowest, and the soft base version will be a middle ground between them in terms of rebound speed and strength. Alright, now speaking of softness, let's talk about the Hyperion's skate compatibility next. Now, unlike most soft base pads, the soft base Hyperion is actually surprisingly compatible with dot skates, but compatibility here will heavily depend on your grip style and your hand weight, as heavier grips will likely cause dot skates to bottom out, but lighter grips won't. So while you can use dot skates here on the soft base version of the Hyperion, their compatibility will be 50-50 depending on the aforementioned factors, but aside from dot skates, the soft base Hyperion is fully compatible with all full-size stocks, half-size speed stocks, and donut skates. In terms of the other versions of the Hyperion, the firm base variant will be compatible with all skate types, just like we saw with the Saturn Pro Firm, and the extra soft base version will only be compatible with donut skates and full-size stock skates, maybe some half-size speed stock skates depending on their surface areas. Now, in terms of what skates felt best here on the Hyperion, due to its balanced performance profile, the pad is fully compatible with either speed, balance, or control skates. As I mentioned earlier, I tested pretty much every skate in my collection here in my Hyperion over testing, and I just settled on using the Obsidian Air Donut and the Unusual Way Sports Silver Fox skates over my testing as they just felt the best for me, but keep in mind the skates are very much personal preference, and you can use pretty much whatever type of skate you want here on the Hyperion. Just make sure the skate's shape is compatible with your Hyperion's base firmness. Next, let's talk about the Hyperion's base. The Hyperion is using Lethal Gaming Gear's textured base. This is the base you might have seen on some of Lethal Gaming Gear's more recent pads, but going forward this is going to be the base on pretty much all of their upcoming pads. Now, compared to the bases we saw in the Saturn Pro Firm and the non-Pro Neptune, the Hyperion's base is obviously very different. The material is still the same as the Saturn Pro base, being made out of Simflex, formerly Poron, but instead of being non-textured like the Saturn Pro's base, the Hyperion's base has a texturing runner across it that gives it an almost carbon fiber look to it. And just like the Saturn Pro base, the Hyperion's base isn't exactly sticky to the hand despite the Slimflex material, but it does anchor itself decently well to desktops, but it'll be best anchored if you press the pad down onto your desk, the same process we use to anchor pads like the Saturn and the Coruscant Samurai. But once anchored, the base did perform quite well and I didn't have any issues with the pad shifting or tilting during use. But if you feel like the base isn't anchoring properly or strongly enough for your use case, you can spray water to the pad's base to increase its adhesion because it is Slimflex, formerly Poron, but as I just mentioned, in my case I didn't find this to be necessary as the base performed completely fine with any moisture applied to it. But while the base does perform quite well, just like the Saturn Pro Firm's base, the Hyperion's base does attract dust, pet fur, and other other debris quite strongly. Thankfully though, since the base's texturing is quite thin, you still can easily clean the base by brushing debris off with your fingers or wiping it off with a damp cloth. So if you notice over time that your Hyperion's base isn't anchoring as well as it did initially, be sure to give it a quick clean. Now, to be clear, this issue isn't unique to the Hyperion. All types of slim flex bases have this issue. Again, this is not unique to the Hyperion. I just wanted to highlight this in case you have any issues with your base over long-term use. Next, let's jump over to the pad's edges and talk about its edge stitching. The Hyperion's edge stitching is pretty much the same style as the edge stitching we've seen on Lethal Gaming Gear's other pads. It's made out of the same polyester material as the pad surface, but interestingly enough, the Hyperion's edge stitching is slightly shorter than the pad surface, maybe about half a millimeter or so. Traditionally on Lethal Gaming Gear's previous pads, we've seen it even with the surface, so this is a bit of an interesting change here on the Hyperion. Now the edge stitching is rounded as expected, and it is very easy to run your arm up and down or across the edge stitching without any additional unnecessary friction, but I will say the height difference between the surfacing and the edge stitching does mean there's a little more friction than you'd see on a pad like the Lethal Gaming Gear Saturn Pro Firm, whose edge stitching is even with the surface, so keep in mind there's going to be a slight bit of extra friction here on the Hyperion's base because the shorter edge stitching compared to Lethal Gaming Gear's previous pads. Now, one other very interesting area to the Hyperion is how it handles moisture. Given the pad's similarities to the Saturn series, I expected this pad to have a similar degree of moisture absorption, but disappointingly the Hyperion actually has the worst moisture absorption out of any Lethal Gaming Gear pad I've tested to date. Any moisture that makes contact with the pad surface will slowly, and I cannot emphasize this enough, slowly drain into the pad surface. From my testing, it takes approximately 45 seconds for a droplet of water to drain into a dry area, while on the Saturn Pro, water drains into the pad almost instantaneously. I'm honestly quite surprised that the Hyperion's absorption is so slow, as the surface stitching is much wider and looser than the Saturn's, but regardless, despite the Hyperion's poor water absorption properties, since the surface weaving is made out of polyester, it'll be resistant to humidity, so high humidity environments likely won't be an issue, but sweat can be a major issue, as very sweaty hands or arms have the potential to soak the surface of the pad, causing slow spots. Now this is true for a lot of pads out there, including the Saturn series. If you soak the surface it got really slow as well, but much more so here in the Hyperion due to its poor moisture absorption properties. But I wanted to highlight this aspect of the pad here in the Hyperion, as the potential for some moisture related performance inconsistencies is much higher here on the Hyperion than it is on Lethal Gaming Gear's other pads, such as the Saturn. And speaking of performance inconsistencies, another thing to watch out here for the Hyperion is dust, pet fur, and other debris. Unlike the Saturn and Neptune series pad from Lethal Gaming Gear, which have much denser, tighter knit surfacings, the Hyperion's wider surface stitching allows pet fur, dust, and other debris to fall into the pad's surface stitching into the lower levels of the pad. Now admittedly, dust isn't a massive issue, it's purely cosmetic, but crumbs and larger pieces of debris and pet fur specifically are major issues here, as they can get stuck in the pad's lower stitching, potentially causing tracking issues. Over my testing, I had multiple instances of my mouse mistracking due to pet fur embedded in the pad's surface, so I ended up having to thoroughly inspect the pad surface before I used it every single day to ensure there was no debris or fur lodged in the pad surfacing to prevent any issues during use. Now to be clear, this issue again isn't unique to the Hyperion. Other pads with wider surface stitchings have these issues too, such as the Fanatic-2 I mentioned earlier, but I still wanted to mention this aspect of the pad, as Lethal Gaming Gear's other pads such as the Saturn and Neptune, due to their tighter surface stitchings, do not have this issue. Now the best way to avoid any debris related issues here with the surfacing is to cover the pad when it's not being used. You can also put the pad back in its packaging, of course if you cut the sides to make it a lot easier. Either covering the pad or putting it back in the packaging overnight helped to significantly cut down the frequency of tracking related issues on the pad, but even during use the potential for debris to get lodged in the pad is still quite high, so keep this in mind if you're considering the Hyperion, especially if you have dogs or cats who shed a lot of fur, as you'll have to inspect and clean the Hyperion surfacing significantly more frequently than you'd have to do on any of other Lethal Gaming Gear's pads. And lastly, let's talk about bare arm and sleeve usage here on the Hyperion. Since the surface is a lower friction surface, again kind of similar to the Saturn Pro with a little bit more textural feedback, the pad is very skin friendly and doesn't cause any irritation or discomfort or any unnecessary friction during use. But arm sleeves on the other hand are are a bit of a mixed bag, as due to the surface's wider weaving, some arm sleeve materials are very rough and very high friction, while others are less so. All arm sleeve types, regardless of their material, will still be higher friction than using the pad with a bare arm. Some are more usable than others though. I found that sleeves like the Skypad sleeve and the TJX sleeves were the most usable, again slightly higher friction than bare arm, but still totally usable, while thicker sleeves like the Focus sleeve have very high friction and were very controlled here on the Hyperion to almost an unusable degree. So while some types of arm sleeves are compatible here with the Hyperion, it'll heavily depend on the sleeve's material, stitching, and thickness, so compatibility here is going to be a bit of a 50-50, which is a shame as using an arm sleeve would prevent any moisture related performance inconsistency issues here on the Hyperion, but again their compatibility will be very hit or miss here due to the pad surfacing. Alright, well in closing, overall the Hyperion is a solid all around pad. Again, this collaboration between Pulsar and Lethal Gaming Gear was rather unexpected, but I do quite like the Hyperion as it's just a faster Saturn Pro with balanced friction coefficients, but unfortunately the pad is still X-axis optimized at the end of the day, albeit slightly here on the soft base version, but enough to not classify this pad as a hybrid pad. Again, personally I think it falls into the balanced pad classification, but the pad does perform extremely well despite this, and due to its balancing nature it is very well suited for all game and aim types, and just like all the other Lethal Gaming Gear pads I've covered on the channel, the pad's quality is superb aside from that one little frayed stitch on the side, but again that's a very minimal problem. I do think this pad is a great addition to Lethal Gaming Gear and Pulsar's lineups, being the perfect middle ground between the Venus and the Saturn series, at least in Lethal Gaming Gear's case, and the different base options give a wide variety of customization for different performance levels. But I'd be amiss not to reiterate the biggest Achilles heel of this pad, its surface, as while this unique surface weaving gives the Hyperion amazing performance, it's very susceptible to moisture and dust and debris, specifically pet fur, as debris can get stuck in the wider surface stitching, causing performance issues if they're not removed prior to use. Again, this issue isn't unique to the Hyperion, all pads with wider surface stitchings have these issues, but it's the biggest downside to the Hyperion in my opinion, as Lethal Gaming Gear's other pads, such as the Saturn and the Neptune that I talked about earlier, are much more resistant to debris. But aside from those issues, the Hyperion is still a good pad, definitely worth checking out if you want an X-axis optimized balance pad, but I would avoid this pad if you're in a dustier environment or you're in a situation where you have a lot of pets and there's going to be a lot of cat fur floating around, as this pad does have a lot of issues with debris. But if you'd like to learn more about the Lethal Gaming Gear X Pulsar Hyperion, I will have a couple product links for the pad down in the description so you can learn more. But that's going to be everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much again to Lethal Gaming Gear for sending over the Hyperion for review. I greatly appreciate it. Big thank you to our channel members Yuki89, Prince, It Was Luck, and Lunaris. Our channel members make what I do here on the channel with the in-depth reviews and the Teardown project possible, so thank you all very much for your continued support. If you'd like to support the channel, you can become a member here over on YouTube for only $2 Canadian, or you can use code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming, Mech Keys, TJ Exclusives, and a couple other retailers to save yourself some money off your orders and help directly support the channel. Thanks again for watching my review of the Lethal Gaming Gear X Pulsar Hyperion, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.